I'd like to call the meeting of the Community Finance Committee to order. Please call roll.
Mr. Arbogast,
Here.
Mr. Brisbane,
Here.
Mr. Cox,
Here.
Mr. Davis, Dr. Fiorenza, here, Ms. Guerrero, Mr. Imhoff,
Here.
Dr. Johnson,
Yes.
Mr. Kohler,
Here.
Mr. Miller,
Here.
Dr. O'Donnell.
First item on our agenda is approval of our last meeting's minutes from October 17th. Does anyone have any corrections or questions to the minutes? And if not, can I have a motion to approve?
So moved. Second.
Vote all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed?
I'm just abstaining.
Good idea. That's perfectly acceptable.
Well, that's, I mean.
We have no one in the audience, anyone via Zoom for public comments?
None.
Okay. Then our first discussion item is the financial dashboard. We want to start with the packet on the board goals. It was in our second email that went out with the packet. That kind of introduced the dashboard piece. Whoever asked for this to go out, did they want to cover it briefly or?
Okay, so maybe Tom can talk goals, and then of course I'll talk to the about
I mean, we did talk to it in draft form.
The person that asked for this to go out is one Steve Miller.
No, yes.
Yes.
Oh, right.
No, at the last meeting, the request was to get a copy of the board goals.
I have so much more to say.
And this is a copy.
Yes.
This is a copy of the board goals. At the time, I kind of just narrated through them in draft form.
Right.
This has them, and the pertinent ones are in the finance section, which would be page 3.
Okay. So this just sort of reiterated what Tom shared with us orally at the last meeting. The first item is the financial dashboard that we want to introduce tonight. The key pieces being on the right hand side, the due dates for this would be for the first phase CFC contributions due in March of next year, and then the final completion at the board level in May. The specific pieces that they've identified for CFC to discuss related to the dashboard are what's included in it, who can be compared to, and what does it actually look like. So then I handed out this 1-page sheet that's at your desk with just some of my own initial thoughts along those lines, just to get the conversation started. When we spoke about this at the October meeting, given the timeline with the holidays and then having to have something all sort of laid out to the board in March, and our next meeting being in March, we thought, well, maybe this is going to be a sort of subcommittee project with a couple members of the committee. But I think as much conversation as we can have tonight would reduce the amount of work we do offline in the subcommittee format. So that's why I wanted to kind of start putting some thoughts down. So we can kind of dive into this, or if the board members want to give any other sort of background or thoughts on the direction of the committee. I'd love to hear it. I know Graham put together the other piece that was at your place with some ideas of your dashboard as well. So we start with that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Unless Tom, you want to say anything about the goals, the board goals that were handed out.
No, I think we're ready.
All right.
Graham, do you want this projected? Zoom or YouTube?
It doesn't matter to me
Okay.
if it is. If there's somebody out there who wants to watch it, sure.
Okay. Thank you.
I have to bring it up. I don't have to.
All right. So I'm happy to facilitate this dashboard conversation, and very wise of you, Steve, to have led with this goals document, because you'll notice that the first goal here, it falls under communication and community outreach. But what's enumerated is a dashboard of key metrics for district and school performance. So the board in its goal setting actually wanted a dashboard that actually addresses lots of different elements about the district. And obviously, finances is a big subcomponent thereof. So for the purpose of this conversation, when we get to it, we're going to be super interested in what CFC members have in terms of brainstorming ideas of what ought to go into the financial portions of the district dashboard. So if you go over then to this handout that we're providing here, it says suggested dashboard and board member placement content. So the reason, me as a board member, I see this actually in two ways. You think about a dashboard, and that's community facing, families facing, and so forth, and it's important information and metrics we want to be able to report out to the community. At the same time, I think we as board members need to always have as an atlas or a reference the facts about our school, the facts about our demographics, our key priorities always in front of us, the strategic plan elements are always in front of us. So for that reason, I call this both some dashboard elements and also a placemat elements that I want our board members to have, or at least me, at a minimum, me to have on hand as we're sitting at the school board. So for that reason, if you go to slide 2, you'll see I've got a box around this thing called equity lens. And that's because I, as a board member, always want to apply the equity lens, the things we're looking at. And in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see this thing I call the true north, which is always ask yourself, what's in the best interest of students? So even though I'm walking through some stuff that could end up as part of a dashboard, I've set it into what I'm thinking of as a placemat that I always want to have handy as an atlas as we as board members are attempting to steer the ship. So there's your marathon metaphors you were hoping for tonight. All right, so to do this, I think you got all this table set with the basics of your district. So what I've got here on slide 2 is student demographics and employee demographics. And what I've done is I've sort of pieced together different sources of information that you have already. And this is extremely rough form. But again, this is table setting data as you go into things that would be measurable as metrics going on a dashboard. And this, you may be curious, this cut of student demographics and enrollment, we were given in PDF form the student enrollment data dating back to 1996. And I put it in Excel and then did some conditional formatting to try to illuminate some trends around changes in our demographics. And also, I think it's sort of interesting, we have a pretty fixed size of community that we serve, but I think how our total enrollment changes over time is kind of interesting as well. So that's why I've got stats in there about how our demographics are changing, and then also what's happened in total student enrollment over the last 20-some years. All right, slide 3. This is more about me as a board member. We got to be anchored to the mission, vision, and values, and our strategic plan and priorities. And we got to always have that handy. It needs to become second nature for us as board members to be able to be anchored to those things. All right, if you go to slide 4, peer districts. Even now our board is like, well, comparable districts. We ought to make sure we're doing something similar to comparable districts. Well, who are those districts? This, where I pulled this list, it was out of Tom, this is your spreadsheet benchmarking superintendent salaries. And I don't know if right now our board can say, yeah, these are our peers. So this is again what I'm going to have handy as a placemat as I serve on the board. Now, I think this is something we want to have present on our dashboard facing the community. These are our peer districts, but we should also have a footnote as to this is why these are our peers. And I personally don't even know the history of these districts. Did this committee come up with this list?
It was the predecessor committee to this committee, and use the same methodology as the D97 Fort Committee.
Yeah.
Of looking at total enrollment, low income percentage in EAV for people, and then half or 2 times on either side of it, I believe.
Okay,
So it dates back a ways, I think it dates back to my time consulting the PMA/4S5, it was determined.
yeah, I knew there was some borrowing there. And then I've got the bullets there, what I think were the inputs. And I think whatever they are, I think that could be a footnote as far as the dashboard goes. Because this becomes quite relevant when you get into the dashboard.
And if a little bit of color, I won't go too deep, but prior to this district kind of was in and out of using the NWPA, which is a larger population that from a, you know, which I think every school in here is part of that group. Okay. Yes.
I think it's a group that is largely go for a personnel, staffing,
Yes.
decision-making.
I mean,
It's HR.
the criteria is you need to join NWPA, right? I mean, so it is not that, so this group are those schools
Yeah, that's
within that population then that met certain, you know, three criteria that are spelled out. So,
Yeah. Well, okay, so we have 8 tiers, and that may sound like a short list to some, but as long as we have a great logic and rationale for
Yeah.
that and fact-based, it's fantastic. We could
Mhm.
have that. Okay. So slide 5 gets into academic achievement. And it's an important set of metrics that we would want to include in the dashboard. But some other goal subcommittee can work on this. Dr. Johnson, you'll recognize that I just cut and pasted this out of the school profile.
Correct.
And-
Your formatting looks great, I'm just gonna say.
And, you know, obviously, anybody can go on and look on the state report card, but that's really an apples to oranges, you know, compare us to state data. If at some point we get to a point where we can compare our academic data to our peer districts, that I think would be quite relevant. Okay. So now we get into slide 6. And slide 6 is where we're starting to grab information for a financial dashboard. I personally think that the table set or lead information should be a summary of the fiscal policies that govern us. I don't know if ISB still does its governance recognition. If we have it or not, we should mention it. What's our current audit rating and what's our current credit rating? Then it becomes almost a case of you can have a kitchen sink here. This is where, Steve, I think your list, you can start putting anything here you want. So I grabbed the fund balance target comparison as one thing. For me, I would make this a 2 y-axis chart. But I think it's something else that should go in sort of this front end table setter information would be the pie chart that shows our sources of revenue and our expense categories. It's pretty standard for school districts. All right, slide 7. So to me, the gold standard for fiscal reporting would be per pupil comparisons to the peer districts. And so what I've shown here is 4 different examples of that type of analysis. We can use all of these, use none of these. This is where the CFC is going to need to brainstorm and decide what's relevant. But to me, that is like the most objective criteria for evaluating how districts performing and using funds and so forth. So slide 8, you know, you can transition from the financial portions of the dashboard into things like facilities and capital projects. I've just got to mention here on slide 8 that there ought to be a Gantt that shows P2, project 2, and how it's doing both in terms of construction progress and budget versus expenditure. I think there's a sub-working group on facilities tied to goals. Is that right, Tom? That I think that was you, Fred, and Tim, who were working on facilities. Either we can invent that here or they can invent that. So then that gets us to my last slide, slide 9, which is sort of an explore discussion of what the group thinks is important or valuable or useful as a financial metrics for a dashboard.
I think this is a great start. Any specific questions on any of this for Graham before we sort of open a little more widely?
I just have a comment that just to elaborate a little more on something he said. So in terms of who this is for and how it can be used, and clearly, there's a community focus, but Graham's really hit on it in my mind an important thing, which is it's for the board to be grounded, because Graham's a new board member, but a prior experienced board member. We have 3 other board members that are new to this district, and I've been here for since Adam. Okay, and so I've seen these numbers. I know these numbers, but the goal is that when we're making decisions, that we have a leveling of information that really can we don't have to go digging through it, deep through it, and it just can provide those newer board members, et cetera, so that we're all starting from the same place in terms of just the data. So I think that is a huge plus with this, and then the CFC can provide the voice of what things should they consider that they should be level in their thinking on.
Maybe one other thing I'll say is, if you look, starting back on slide 6, where here's some suggested things within this, that table setting and foundation building. I think if we can get into a routine and a good practice of setting this information up, keeping it updated, monitoring it, having this foundation already in place is going to be very helpful when at some point in the future this district has to go to a referendum. And we're not just then at that point inventing on the fly or quickly a solid evidence-based foundation for a business case that we might someday have to make. So that's the reason I sort of view this as you build this from the bottom, brick by brick up.
So one of my sort of foundational questions about this to both of you and both of some of the points you were saying about the audience, as well as kind of the process for keeping it current and relevant, I guess, is do you strictly see this as kind of a dashboard of annual data that's refreshed once a year, or is this a more active document that maybe is supplementing / replacing some of your monthly financial board reports, and then requires a much more active sort of process to keep it going? One of my concerns, like, all of these are good data points, but comparative data is it's all annual data, and it's only available once everybody is filed, and it just becomes very stale. So I think there's a desire to have more current data about the district itself, but then where do you draw the line between the monthly financial reports and treasury reports and things versus something that's a little higher level and more for a data?
Do you have an opinion on that, Tom?
Yeah, I would answer more of a bigger picture, longer term look versus monthly type information. Trends that paint where we've come from, where we're going. When you look at this, there's a 5-year forward look, there's a 20-year, 10-year back look. That's the grounding, because the board gets the monthly reports. And that's current and they see it, but this puts it in context in my mind.
I would agree with that. This is not intended to be a live look or in any way replace the reports that the chief business officer gives to the board. I think you might, probably once a quarter, you would go in and refresh something, because maybe that's the frequency at which something like your fund balance target might be changing. But that would be it. I think this needs to be high level.
Yeah, the student specific data, the traditional school data that comprises the first 5 slides or whatever that you have on here. These are annual data points. And that's just simply what they are.
And I think that's good enough for the purpose of this dashboard.
Yeah, on my list of potential things to include, like the only thing that I was thinking of that was more important than that was if we were also wanting this to be kind of a budget monitoring tool where you're looking at year to date versus budget on revenue or expense side at some higher level. But if you're comfortable with what you're getting in your board reports already, I think it's gonna be easier to maintain and it's gonna less muddy the waters, I think, if you're trying to do that here as well as having your monthly financials.
We have the tool that I think best gets at that is something we've had for a few years now, which is the quarterly variance report, which, it gets it. I would just put that name there and then allow the finance, the community to look at that and provide input, but it provides expense and revenue progress versus where we should be. It might be more visual, so there might be things to do to make it better, but that's the tool today.
Anyone else have any? Want to share any thoughts on the dashboard piece? So I guess I have one more question, just sort of about the philosophy and the process and sort of what our deliverable is in this. I guess since it's a more static type of thing, are we envisioning this is just something that someone's going to cut and paste sort of it all together onto the website? So I guess I'm trying to understand what our deliverable is. Is it an Excel tool that's got all the charts built and you drop the numbers in, or is it more just illustrative, like here's what we think it should look like, and then you guys are going to actually build the dashboard itself?
So I thought the assignment for the CFC is to decide which pieces of information ought to be in it. And we're letting administration build the thing. Because it is going to reside in their website.
So mocking things up like this, cutting and pasting it, is as far as we would need to go.
Yeah.
No.
And the only reason I did my mock-up cut and paste was because I wanted to at least pull the real examples of types of information.
Sure.
Right now, I think what we need from CFC is for you to say, here's the 5 things you really should have in this, or 7 or whatever.
I bet we can come up with more than that.
Well, I think it would be the things, and then and you kind of started to cover it, and how we would want to maybe look at those things. So, as an example, we want to look at per student spending, and we want to look at it. We could say we want to look at that trended just ourselves. We want to look at that against our peer districts. We want to look at that, there's a lot of different ways of sharing data. It depends on what are we trying to communicate here?
Yeah, almost every key data point, there's a historical trend here, there may be some projected data also, and then there's a most recent year comparative analysis.
And we don't want to create something that becomes a huge work task for the administration. That's why my feeling is if the whole dashboard was updated or re-looked at and refreshed once a quarter for those pieces of information where something could potentially change, to me that would be good enough. Then I think the obvious one there would be a Gantt that's tracking the progress of project 2, that you wouldn't want to be stale. You want to have that relatively current.
That also resides in it's governed by, oh, I'm sorry. There's a separate board goal, right, that specifically speaks to a facilities dashboard.
Yeah.
So we know that we would want that here. Is it do we want CFC here to chime in on that dashboard as well, or wait to see that mocked up by, I don't know, the facilities committee, or how that unfolds? What's the process for that piece of this? I know that also Tony, because that had been a kind of an outstanding goal of mine. Tony has been working on that with a consultant on his level too, and so there's kind of various entry points into that goal that eventually will populate this full dashboard.
My first thought would be let facilities committee on that, not have CFC weigh in. Like a bunch of sense.
Yeah, I agree. I would say if there's anything, you know, that is, okay, when you do it, when we're reporting on big expenditures, if there's any things to provide as, you know, these are absolute musts that you need to do, that could be used by the facilities group.
Yeah, I guess I kind of see the project 2 dashboard or dashlet within the dashboard as hitting both groups. I think the timeline Gantt chart piece is probably not in our purview, but tracking the budget and how that's going is certainly going to be a CFC. We're missing a couple of our.
So I was just gonna ask if the members of the board, it might be helpful as we're starting to think, if you can just say a little bit more or reflect a little bit more about the kinds, I mean, there's a lot here already, but just to make, you know, thinking about like these per pupil expenditure points that you've picked, I assume there's infinity of these that you could look at, right? So are there certain things like that you always look at as you're making a decision, or that you often wish you knew, or, you know, in your experience working with this stuff, what is, you know, what would be of the most use to you?
I have an answer, but Tom, you can go first.
So one that's not on any of this is the evidence-based funding model. Okay, so I would say that is a piece that we have in our goals elsewhere, and it actually is in the peer district kind of one of the criteria. So that's one of the criteria that, you know, one thing, you know, the 5-year projection model, which is really just looking at our fund balance over time, is kind of a bread and butter staple. So that
This thing?
As it relates to the board policy on
bingo.
fund
So that, I mean, those are ones that are you know, front and center. But then I think kind of weaving into the dialogue that Graham brought up, because there are things that we don't necessarily talk about at a high frequency, and when we do, that's where you have, I would say, a disadvantage of board members, you know, and of other pieces of data that are, you know, from my perspective as having been through it, have come up but are not frequent. So I'm going to give a different answer than others, but I can tell you when we go into and we deal with contract negotiations, we have a very data-driven approach. And so we get into a lot of the details of what is our spending compared to other districts on a per student basis. What is our, I mean, many of these measures come up, but they might be more, you know, they're not part of everyday board discussions, and as a result, many of the board members, you know, would not have that information in their head, and they'd have to go digging through to find stuff. Does that answer your question? Partially?
Partially,
Okay.
yeah.
But you're right,
I'll take a portion.
especially on the spending side, you know, there's infinite number of ways we could slice that, and Graham's example has salary and benefits per student, but we could talk, it could be special ed, transportation, operations and maintenance. Pick whatever category of spending you want, and we could have a comparison on that, and so I think that'd be good conversations for us to have on which ones are really key from an operational standpoint on the districts making strategic decisions to spend more or less in one area or another.
My answer would be definitely this fund 5-year forecast of the fund balance, and we have a pretty aggressive fund balance target of 25 to 50%. You know, so where we're projected to be within that window, that to me is critical. And then among these four charts I put on slide 7, OpEx per pupil, OpEx trends per pupil, and salaries and benefits per pupil, those 3 of the 4 would be the most important. I think long-term debt for students, that's not as important.
Yeah, although that one did come up when we were doing our financing, you know, so that's more of it's not an everyday thing, but it when we're making big decisions, that information comes into play. But I agree with what Graham's saying in terms of, you know, OpEx per pupil. Now, when you do salaries and benefits per pupil, this is looking at the enterprise, or is this looking at certain looking at you know, teachers and that the like?
So this is just all salaries and benefits. There's other, you know, obviously, as we've said, there's many levels you can drill down,
Yeah.
but I feel like for a dashboard, you're really looking for big needle movers. You can even, I've seen data where you're looking at number of administrators per pupil, and but I want to avoid sort of rabbit holes like that. So to me, that's not as big a deal. That's just my 2 cents. But again, the CFC may feel differently. But so for me, this is the enterprise look.
So then I guess a related question would be, if there's really 2 audiences, one of which is the board and the other of which is the community, then we also would need to identify the metrics that are most asked or most of concern or most valuable to the community, right? Because this can help with that as well.
100%.
Yeah.
Because it's the board members' responsibility to be deep in this stuff. And they can they'll have access to and can pick apart things like, you know, the division between salaries and administrator costs, and they've got access to all of Mr. Arbogast's reports and so forth. So I think of this more as really facing the community.
Yeah, so I guess that's would also be helpful as we think about what should be here, what are the questions, you know, I'm relevant new here. So most of the questions I've seen were project 2 funding related, but over the long term, what are the questions and things that people tend to be consistently interested in?
So property tax related data and
Yeah,
trends and
probably so.
comparatives there, I think would certainly interest the community.
And the fund balance obviously is of interest to everyone, but.
And I think also to sort of, you know, provide, you know, good evidence to the community. We can't forget the comparison to the peer districts for this stuff on slide 7, because even right now, our school profile will tell you we spend 23,000 and some change per student, but it's kind of it doesn't mean anything unless you can compare it to what other districts are spending.
We're missing a couple of our community members. I'm just wondering what people's thoughts are on next steps between now and our March meeting. What a process would be to kind of pull together a recommendation over the next couple of months. If there's anyone interested in subgroup, on that.
I mean, I'm happy to work in the subgroup.
Thank you. And I will too.
Okay.
And I think too, we can internally start to pull some of this together and take some of the big picture and make it a kind of realistic, and then in March, we can also bring that back for feedback and see, are we hitting where you want to go? Is there things we're missing? Are there things we've done that are representing what we want to see? So we'll pull together what we can too, and see what we can do for feedback.
Thank you for the help. I think maybe that our first step is to kind of get our list of stuff together. Run that by you and see how much of that you can easily pull together, and then certainly pull together comparative data. Do some tools. Let's see. Do we need to revisit the peer group process now so that we've got the, if we think we want to change it, so we've got that portion locked in. We have a lot of history and it hasn't changed in a while. I'm pretty comfortable keeping it as is, but if anyone wants to recommend tweaking that, we should probably do that now.
The criteria,
Yeah, this sort of the methodology
Yeah,
that we're
I
used
think-
to create this sort of, like you said, sort of subset of the NWPA.
yeah, and just so that I wanna make a point here. These are all NWPA, there was no criteria that we started with, nor, NWPA was not a criteria. That's the way that the data using the criteria chosen automatically left it to be those schools. I mean, so. Does that make sense to you?
We threw the net statewide, but
We
the
could, yeah,
end result is the districts like OPRF are all suburban high school districts. And I didn't explain, so on my list, on my sheet, the little parenthetical number at the end is how many buildings are in the district. Because there's a number of larger high school districts that maybe would be at the individual school level like us, but there are 5 or 6 schools in the district, and on the district scale, they're just different because they're so much larger. So these are mostly 1 and 2 school.
So is your list the same?
Yeah, I think they're all high school districts.
Yeah, and I think I think Barrington is in WPA, but otherwise that's an all high school district group. Isn't it?
there might be 1 or 2 more, I mean, there's been some growth and,
That's good, yeah.
part of the challenge is NWPA. From when I first got involved, has grown probably by 8 or 10 different districts. And it's a lot of districts that are out like Erie and that area that are not, of the same demographic as some of these, so it's shifted somewhat. I think there's 31 now or something like that.
Anyone else with anything they want to share? Yeah, for process, okay, then you and I can kind of connect some next steps then. Should be fun.
Sounds good.
All right, thanks, Graham, again for putting this together. I think it's off to a good start. Next agenda item are projections and assumptions. Sorry.
Sure, so I will turn this over to Brian in a second here to talk through the documents that are uploaded here. What we wanted to do is we really kick off our preparation for projection season in the early winter, starting when we come back from break, is look at where our previous assumptions and projections were, what were driving those assumptions, what are the ones we know need to be changed or updated, and then take input from CFC in terms of either agreement or opportunities to make changes. So Brian, if you'd like, I'll turn it over to you now and you can walk us through.
Sure, thanks, Tony. So, what we were kind of hoping to accomplish tonight was, there was this request, both mostly from the CFC level, also at the board level, to kind of come to a better understanding and display of what types of assumptions go into the financial projection model, how those decisions are made. So we kind of wanted to, we brought forth this as an example for CFC to evaluate first, both in terms of format, and then, if we want to get into a discussion of how some of the assumptions are developed, we can certainly do that. But if you recall in previous versions of the financial projections, our assumptions page was essentially a 1 or 2 page Word document that kind of spelled out some background on the assumptions, as well as what various percentages were and things of that nature. They spanned pretty a wide breadth in terms of, there was generic property tax information, but things that even got as specific as some of the, quote unquote, smaller grants that we've received, down to, a maintenance grant of $25,000 or $50,000 in some cases. So what I tried to accomplish with the exhibits that you have in front of you are, first, more of a spreadsheet table type look to the assumptions. And actually, Ed, I'm going to go ahead and pull up this exhibit just so it's easier to see while I'm talking about it. So this is kind of the key document that I'm referring to, summary of key assumptions for financial projections. And this was more or less a 1 page look, and I know it goes a little bit longer than a page, but of trying to identify the main drivers of things that can shift our fund balance the quickest, and sort of what a change looks like in terms of an assumption. So to kind of help with the conversation, I provided a couple years worth of history on each of the assumptions, as well as the percentages or data points going out the 5 years forward, kind of like we were having in the previous discussion. It's helpful to have both history and to look out ahead to kind of determine where we got to that basis point of how we developed our assumption. And then finally, there was also, a good amount of discussion about what does a change in that assumption look like. So that rightmost column of the table shows you some of that sensitivity analysis that we've talked about. So, what does a 1% change in faculty senate salaries equate to in terms of dollars? And then how can you apply that going forward? So to simplify it, I just included the one column for a change in 1 year only. So if we stick with faculty senate salaries as the example, you'll see that next fiscal year, the assumption is those salaries will go up about 4.5%. If that was to become 5.5% for some reason, that equates to $302,000. If that change, then applied across all 5 years, there is going to be some compounding involved, but you kind of get the general idea. It's another 302,000 4 more times. So it just kind of helps with some of the internalization of what does a change in assumption mean. Conversely, if we're talking about purchase services or supplies, some type of contract such as transportation, if we keep having this accumulated effect of an increase in rate or a decrease in rate, how that's going to swing in the fund balance or our total expense line in the financial projections. So, formatting wise, it's the table's just kind of laid out where anything in black text is a known value. Anything in red is where we have assumptions built in. A couple, one or two cells will have blue text, which is an example of items where since the last projection was done, certain information has become available since then. Maybe a contract has been approved or has been brought forward for approval that is different than our assumption. And that is one that we know we'll have to revisit in the future or change in terms of the next iteration of the financial assumptions. So, you know, format wise, I just kind of wanted to stop here for a minute and kind of gather some feedback on from the committee in terms of, you know, do they like this layout? Is there anything that stands out in terms of, you know, needing to be added or maybe is not considered as important and could be dropped? Things of that nature. I do still think that it is helpful to also maintain that Word document that we've had in previous versions of the financial projections just for some additional background. So you'll see that included in your materials too. It's just trimmed down so that it doesn't duplicate some of the information that's already shown on this table here.
Questions or comments for Brian? I'll go then.
Yeah.
I think this is great. The financial projections are a key piece of our role as a CFC, and I would much rather us be spending some time reviewing the assumptions, talking about the validity of them than just kind of looking at the output on the charts and graphs and saying, oh, okay, we're within the fund balance percentages, is the lines where we want it to be. I think we really need to be reviewing these whenever we get the new projections. I like the idea of calling out, you know, what's changed since the last one. Also, that's going to be helpful as well.
I was just gonna say, this is great and really easy to read and digest, so thank you, Brian, for putting it together.
You're welcome. Thank you.
There's just like one thing I can add, Brian, and I know what it is. It's easy for me to understand what it is. I know what it is. Just on your black data, you know, the known variables. Just in those years, if it's possible to add a note at the bottom, just for something that maybe isn't aware, like you see really like odd jumps, like in replacement tax, you know, 180%. I know what that is and all that. Maybe just a couple extra notes on that, what that is, so that we know it's not. You know, it's just an odd year or something that doesn't fit in with the rest of the.
Okay, sure. Yeah, and that's what's tricky with the current version of, you know, this layout is in our 4 or 5 years of history that are shown here. 2 of the years were heavily impacted by the pandemic, so it really you'll see some very large fluctuations in some of those years that are essentially outlier. You know, if you were to look at a 20-year history of the school district, those 2 years, which would appear to be very large outliers compared to the rest. So, you know, obviously we're confined to the amount of area on a spreadsheet or a graphic that we're displaying, but just wanted to point that out as well. And yeah, thanks for your point on those notes.
So, thank you, Brian. I have been vocal, and this is a big step forward. I would like to see, you know, out of all the things you kind of hit, which ones are the biggest drivers, but student enrollment is one that, you know, somehow or other to be able to get to an impact on that one as well. I mean, that's as much a driver. It impacts how many staff we should have. So it is as big a driver as any of the other ones in the model. So to be able to know and see that, I think, is important. So that would be the only change to this,
Do you know it's on page 2?
Pardon?
Do you know it's on page 2?
No, it is, but I'm saying what I don't know, what it doesn't say is that a change from 3,200 to of 40 students is a penny or $1 million. That's what I might have been unclear on that. What the impact of it is, so that you can look at all of these things and understand what the proportionality is, what the that would be the one end. The other thing is, as we're talking to this, to me, Greg
Yes, sir.
insisted that I say this word.
But can I steal your thunder?
Wait,
Product. Oh, wait, no, process. I get confused.
So I think what I would like to see is that this is the group that is the ones that are the rubber stamp anytime there is a change to any of these measures. And that's why I would keep it to as few, as possible. And I would like to see formality of that, so that we can go back and look and say that on December the 12th, CFC supported moving the healthcare increase from X to Y because of this. And so that we could have that's the word part, that's the history part, so that there's the story behind the data. But as a board member, I would want to say, okay, CFC said they vetted this and, they believe that this is good. That to me is, now that we have this, now that's putting it into a process that says there's no changes unless it goes through process.
I like your description of the process. The term rubber stamp has a bit of a negative connotation to me, but yes, that is, you described the proper role of the CFC for sure. Yeah. The tricky part with this is with the number of times we meet and kind of the gaps in between, we don't get to sort of see the immediate impact of our suggested changes. We'll review all this and see a projection based on this, but if we make that suggestion of X to Y and A to B and changes, then we, at the next meeting, we'll see the impact of that, and then it might get muddled up with other things that have changed and become known, but we can't live with projections. Tony and Brian gets to do that, so that's fine. This is great. Again, Brian, did you have further stuff that you want to walk us through?
Nothing in particular. I guess the follow-up would just be if there's any questions in terms of actual percentages used in the assumptions, or questions as to what happened in certain changes that you're seeing. I guess the only other item of note potentially is on the expense side. Some of the categories are high level in terms of there's a lot of different things grouped within them. So for example, we have a category for other purchase services. We called out transportation and tort insurance because those are two of the larger ones, but then there are quite a few that get jumbled up within that other purchase services line. So you don't see as clear cut of a percentage like you would for transportation. We're showing 6%, 6%, 6%, year after year. The percentages on some of those larger groups can vary. And the reason for that is, as we do our budget process each year with all of the division heads, one of the things we ask them to do is to try to pull out their crystal ball for a few minutes and look at within their department in the next 4 years, what kind of changes do they see occurring that are significant in value? Maybe maybe a world languages department might have some type of textbook adoption that happens once every 4 years, or a license renewal that happens every 3 or 4 years. Things of that nature, that to give us a better feel for why would we see certain fluctuations from one budget year to the next. And then we take all of those and work them into our financial projections. So even if we have an assumption such as other purchase services that we're increasing by inflation each year, you may see, dips or peaks and valleys based on some of that budget information that we're being given from the department heads.
That makes sense. Circling back to Tom's comment about enrollment, I'm wondering if it would be helpful to have FTE information on here also. I think looking at the history and the trends would certainly be interesting, but maybe it's not necessary to break it out as long as any future changes that you are already planning are reflected in the percentages and then just noted somewhere. Because the salary piece is obviously driven by the raises and the number of people.
And that kind of is indirectly what, kept this way, it's simple just to use a census, right? Or an enrollment, but in reality, that enrollment translates to what the resources are that we need. So I don't know whether, you go from one to the other. Would make it transparent, if there's a relationship. Ultimately, that's what it does, right? I mean, you're gonna use that to say an extra 40 students is an extra classroom teacher, it kind of.
Right, and especially based on these current enrollment projections where you're dropping a couple hundred kids in those last 3 years. And does this assume staffing stays the same, or does this assume that through attrition you do reduce a little bit? So being able to know that, I think would be good. Since you asked if there were other questions, I do have a couple just looking at the history, I'm curious about. On the state revenue side, I assume some of those big up and down fluctuations are related to the transportation reimbursement because the transportation expenses were up and down. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. So the transportation reimbursement is a percentage of our expenditures and then can potentially be prorated by the state. So in those years when the pandemic was going on, obviously our expenses were much less, and then they bounced back when we got back to in-person instruction.
Then why on the federal revenue side has it gone down each of the last 3 years despite the ESSER funding and things coming from the federal government?
So on that line, I pulled out any funding that was more of a one-time nature. So things like ESSER or some of the extra food service grants that we got during the pandemic. Those are excluded just to kind of show a little bit more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it. Any other questions or comments for Tony and Brian on this?
Yeah, I guess the last one, and I'm trying to, this is me always taking something simple and making it complex. It would be helpful to know, everything in black, Brian, you said is known, it's fact, it's history, correct?
Yes.
Okay. To me, it would be helpful to know the gap between history and projection estimate. I mean, that's really why we're off. So I think it's good to see it this way. This is, I like this blend of past to future, but if we go in and say that for the state sources, we had predicted a 5% increase each of the last 4 years, and in reality, it was something different. That's kind of the dialogue to say we missed it and we had to adjust. So that would be good data. I mean, we have it because we have it, and when we call it a prediction, somehow or other to be able to call it up for discussionary purposes would be valuable. I don't want to make this thing 3-dimensional. Well, I do, but
yeah, I would agree that I think there'd be value in when we get the update and what's changed. It's not just the new numbers are in here, but maybe it's in the narrative. There's a recap of here's the things that were projections that are now knowns and and what the difference was, I think that would help inform, making assumptions going forward.
Yeah, and I share that because having been through this, I will tell you that point blank, the reason we missed our forecast, our budget, and had a different fund balance over a period of a decade or many years was pretty darn simple. We had a number in here that was not what really happened. Okay, and so if we can know that and then know why, we can say maybe we're a little bit aggressive, maybe we're whatever it is, but that ultimately is what happened. We said one thing and did something else for good or bad reason.
Anything else?
I am just curious what's happening with the transportation line and why the forecasted increase goes down.
Sure.
3%.
And that's one, and that's the one, as Brian mentioned, with blue.
Yeah.
Because now that we have our contract in place, that'll be updated for next year. We had these large drops during the pandemic, as buses were not running to bring students to school. Now that entire labor market has experienced a monumental shift across the board, not just with our district, but across Illinois and a good part of the country has seen wages go up, a demand for drivers go up, while the supply of drivers has gone down. And that is the reality of kind of our percentage of where we had to increase our expenses to make sure that we can continue to find drivers and get our kids to school.
Got it. Thank you.
Any other questions for Brian or for Tony?
I guess I have one more
Sure.
question. Which is, so the projection for increases for the faculty salaries, the faculty senate line. In the later years, those increases are lower than the projected inflation numbers. Is that right?
That's tied to retirements and then the replacement with new staff members. So the contract is fixed out through fiscal year 25-26. But because of because faculty members are putting in for their retirement 3, 4, or even 5 years in advance, we can build that into our calculations for the financial projection. So anytime a faculty member retires, we have a standard spot on the salary schedule that we assume the new employee will be hired at. And then that naturally kind of brings down the percentage that's built into the salary increases for that employee group.
Got it.
Is there a reason why those aren't colored black like some of the other groups in the out years? If the contract goes through 26?
Yeah, just to because of the unknowns associated with things like lane changes and things of that nature, the dollars can shift a little bit.
Sure. I think it'd be better though to align them with the length of the contract. I think that would be clearer for us.
Go ahead and put it in black.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's always subject to someone resigns, gets replaced at a different rates. Your staffing level goes up or down by a person. They're all somewhat variable.
Okay, sure.
Anything else?
One other thought.
Sure.
These ones that show these numbers going up, down, that kind of stuff makes it hard to really.
In the
Yeah.
future or in the
No,
history?
in the history. I'm just looking like going back to outside purchases or transportation, down 20%, down 50%. Would it be at all beneficial to somehow or other get a compounded annual, just to say over the last 5 years, this number, this is an average or compounded annual growth rate of 4%, just to kind of flatten it out.
You could, although I don't know with COVID, given how crazy
Yeah.
the numbers are, I'm not sure that it would work in the current 5-year look back. But ultimately, that would make sense.
I gotta, just jump in.
Okay.
So I just have one, this is just pure curiosity, but the stipends line. So there's an increase from 2.2 to 10.6% in the forecasted stipends. Just curious if there's something going on.
That there were some stipends that were added in the most recent year, both in terms of actual new positions and then also some level changes. So especially on the faculty side, there's almost like a longevity piece, a component to the amount of the stipend, as well as a level depending on how many hours are put into the position. So, each year, the Human Resources Department reviews with athletics and student activities. And I believe there's a full committee that kind of looks at these every year and kind of evaluates, are there certain positions that are, taking more time than what we're paying for it. So there was there was a memo brought forth as part of the staffing components last spring that kind of changed some of the position levels in terms of the stipends.
Got it. Thank you.
Isn't that, stipends were part of the facility contract, the faculty senate contract, are they not, or is that completely, are there two different things of stipends?
Yes, it is part of the faculty senate contract in terms of the dollars per level and longevity, but then the actual placement of that extra duty gets defined by the stipend committee.
All right, anything else on projections and assumptions? Then our last discussion item is just an update on the tax levy. We talked about that in October, and somebody can walk us through kind of what's happened at
Sure.
the last meeting. In that
There
process.
has not been a lot of major changes that have come the way, so the final levy will resemble the tentative levy that was brought forward. It'll be at a 3.5% increase with the resolution to go back and recapture if needed in the future. And then with the acceptance of the errors and adjustment money that comes in, we did consult with our feeder districts. They are this year both going to be levying the maximum amount of the 5%. So we are coming in under, but we feel comfortable about what that means to our long-term fund balance. And then Brian, you have the exact information, but recently, very recently, we just received the actual number for the appeals money that we'll be getting back as compared to using last year's as a placeholder.
Yeah, so we had used the last 2 years we had been notified that amount was about 800,000. So we had used that as our assumption this year. The information just came out late November, and the amount that would apply to the 2023 levy is about $516,000. So that would be the difference in terms of that supplemental levy that gets added after the fact.
And when does this go to the board for final adoption? Next week?
Next week,
Yes.
Any questions, Brian or Tony, on the levy? CPI came out today for November, so we're at, I think it's 3.5% now year to date with 1 month to go. So we're not gonna be hitting the 5% cap in the tax cap for next year's levy, doesn't look like. Any topics for future meetings? I think a major one will be the dashboard in March. Don't have my sheet in front of me with, here it is, other things that we had been talking about. In the spring, I guess maybe preliminary budget conversation potentially, for 2024, 25, it's possible. And maybe, I think we haven't really, maybe we did revisit the EBF a couple of weeks ago, so yeah. Those would probably be the items we'll be working on an agenda between now and then.
So this crew doesn't meet in February. When,
Or, yeah, it's, we scheduled the rest of the meetings for the year, a couple of months ago, so it's March 12th. June 11th and August 13th are the 3 remaining meetings this sort of fiscal year. I guess I don't know why we scheduled it through August. We did. If there's nothing else, really good, I'd like to entertain a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Thank you, Kevin. All in favor?